Okay, this is Chapter 13, Politics, from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions. So for most of modern history, governments did not allow women to vote. In 1848, at the first ever Women's Rights Convention in the United States, a small group of women began a movement for women's suffrage, or the right for women to vote. Suffragists faced criticism, ridicule, and government repression, as well as violence. The fight for suffrage involved both inspiring coalitions and ugly divides. So it's important to note that many suffragists were abolitionists, meaning they worked in campaigns to eliminate the institution of slavery from American society, while some of them used that abolition work to motivate them to start advocating for their own rights as women. So that kind of abolitionism was tied to being a suffragette. But for some suffragettes, they were incredibly racist and excluded black women from their organizations' activities or platforms. There were even some very famous suffragettes that argued that only white women should have been secured the right to vote, and that they would worry about securing the rights for women of color later. What's interesting is, in 1920, the federal government gave suffrage to white and black women, yet black women were not able to fully exercise that opportunity to vote, largely because of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other kind of structures of the Jim Crow segregation that often allowed for an attack on voting or voter suppression, basically preventing someone from being able to register to vote in the first place, so they don't appear on the rolls, so that they can't legally vote. So today, universal suffrage, or the right for all citizens to vote, is the very definition of democracy. But in 1800, this was a radical claim, an idea that didn't yet resonate with most members of the population. So universal suffrage is evidence that change, even radical change, is possible. But institutions may seem too entrenched to change, but the universal suffrage movement shows that this is possible. Though, big asterisk, there's still a lot of people that face issues in gaining access to vote, right? When we look at what the Supreme Court did in recent cases, and again, recent to me, I guess, some of you guys were like in diapers in 2010, but, in the 2010s, the Supreme Court basically gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, which said that if a state had historically discriminated against people of color, if they wanted to change their state law, they would have to go through a kind of oversight process to make sure that their new laws were not discriminatory or targeting minority populations. But I guess the almost completely white Supreme Court in 2010-ish, I think it was somewhere in that range, they decided, nope, not a problem anymore. And they struck down that provision of the Voting Rights Act, acting as if racism is no longer a thing. And what happened within a couple years of them striking down that provision of the Voting Rights Act? You had over 19 states enact voter suppression bills that were targeting people, basically voter ID laws and other laws that, such as, or even not even laws, but sometimes just policies or programs like the Interstate Cross-Check Program, which would basically say, you have the same name as someone that voted in another state, so therefore you're not eligible to vote because you're a legal double voter. Even though they couldn't prove that any of these people double voted, they removed hundreds of thousands of names from the voting rolls in state across state. Not every state participated in the Interstate Cross-Check Program, but especially Georgia is known for this. And, it's incredibly problematic to say, John Smith voted in this other state, so that must be you, right? Even though it's like John R. Smith and you're John L. Smith. It didn't matter if your middle name was wrong. They didn't count suffixes like junior, senior. So obviously Mark Sr. is going to have a Mark Jr., then, you're saying no, sorry, that person already voted, so you guys are the same person, so you can't vote, which you're obviously not. So it's really interesting. There's this documentary that I show in some of my other classes, and in it they discussed the Interstate Cross-Check Program, and one of the men who was removed from the list, he pointed out, why don't they use social security numbers? Why do they use name? not social security number, because social security number will tell you, okay, this person is different from this other person. But they only use names. And what was interesting too is an analysis that was done on the data from the Georgia Interstate Crosscheck Program, where over 400,000 people were knocked off the voting rolls. They found that it overwhelmingly disproportionately affected communities of color, specifically African American, Latinx, and Asian American communities. Especially like for certain Asian communities, you have people that often get kind of monetized to one last name. So you have like everyone becomes Nguyen or Park, and often that might not even be the last name, but it kind of becomes homogenized upon immigration to the US. And so it's kind of common to know a Kim Nguyen or to have the same name, to know people with the same name within certain Asian communities. So using just name is a way that really ends up targeting certain communities of color and eliminating them from the voting rolls based on this kind of false claim that they double voted without any actual evidence. This happened in many states across the country. And remember, some presidential elections are won with a matter of, a couple hundred votes per precinct, tops. So when you're eliminating 400,000 people from the rolls in one state in 1 year, you just think about the kind of exponential, disproportionate nature of something like that. So yeah, we still have a long way to go to actually have universal suffrage. End of rant, sorry. Okay, so moving on to politics. Politics is the word we use to describe the various activities that are involved in determining public policies and electing people to guide that process. So we also talk about in this class the politics of gender. So this is just how people change and resist change to that gendered order, or those expectations we get from society about how gender should be structured. So politics is the main way that we change society, and this chapter is primarily focused on the politics of gender. So under the politics of gender, you can have feminist politics and anti-feminist politics. So feminist politics are politics that involve efforts to make society's gender order less hierarchical and more supportive to the full development of human capacities for everybody. So feminists often disagree about what a feminist utopia looks like, or what a perfectly gender egalitarian society should look like. So it's interesting, feminists are not only wrestling with stubborn governments and anti-feminists, but also with each other, right? It's really interesting how it's so much easier to coalesce against something, right? To say like, I'm anti-feminist. That's easier to get everyone on board. But to say you're feminist, what's interesting is if your goal is to create a less divided society where people have more equity, then that's feminism. And what's interesting is it's not necessarily like one mindset or one worldview or anything like that, because there's so many different kinds of feminists. It's really more so like a lens through which you look at the world, or a philosophy that you can apply to many different social constructs and situations. So, it's interesting. Of course, feminists fight with each other about, like let's say everyone agrees, the organization of gender in society is problematic and causes a lot of issues for men, women, and those who are non-binary or trans. And that can be agreed upon, but then how do we deal with that? What policies should we do? In what way should we approach the issue is very different and subjective, right? And oftentimes in the past, feminist movements were very led by the wealthiest, the whitest women, and so as a result, they didn't really encounter or really think too hard about the issues that affected women that were not wealthy and white. And so they often excluded them from the conversation completely. And obviously, did not win a lot of favor to their cause by doing that, by excluding people from this larger movement. So again, versus anti-feminist politics, it's just committed to keeping gender the way that we believe it is now, preserving the hierarchy of gender to try to prevent feminist change. Okay, so the state itself is a social institution. It's entrusted with the power to regulate everyday life on the behalf of groups. And it's supposed to be dominant in promoting group welfare. So it's called governance, basically. And it includes the process of making decisions for all of us, enforcing our laws, and if the state is a democracy, making sure that the state is accountable to its citizens. So states are important because they wield great power, and more so than really any other social entity that we have. So states have vast resources and the exclusive rights to pass laws, collect taxes, and even detain or imprison people. And, states can then just decide, hey, we're waging a war. And the rest of us, we don't get to vote on that. That just kind of is done in our name. So there's two ways we can think about gender and governance. The first involves the governance of gender. So how gender of residents shapes the way they're treated, right? And the second way to think about gender and governance is the gender of governance, meaning who is holding political office, and does that matter? So both of those we're going to talk about right about now. Okay, so governance of gender is how the gender of residents shapes the way they're regulated. So we like to enforce gender ideologies. At the most basic level, states are doing this in deciding how many and which gender categories we will recognize, right? We often only understand these things in a binary aspect. So states decide whether to require a gender binary, like the public bathroom example, whether to enforce gendered roles within marriage, or to allow trans men and women to modify their names, bodies, or documents. So the gender of residents shapes the way that they are then regulated by the government. So in the US, the federal government and nearly all states require individuals to identify as male or female on birth certificates, driver's licenses, and passports. Versus in other countries, there are third categories or other options. And you start to see this in certain states, right? Obviously in the federal government is very binary still when it comes to understandings of gender. But, like California, for example, will allow for people to get documentation. And they just recently are adding an option for birth certificates as an option for intersex. Because again, we talked about this before, not only is gender something that's socially constructed, that we say, oh, you're this or you're that, but that's our creation. But so is biological gender. There are people who are born, actually, like statistically more likely than someone with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. These people are born with mixed sex characteristics, right? We talked about this a long time ago in this class. And so, not acknowledging that on a birth certificate really reinforces this idea that doctors should perform a bunch of unnecessary surgeries on babies' genitals to fit them into the category of either male or female, when biologically they were somewhere in that mix. So the state gets to determine what kind of documentation you can have. Like, for example, there's this reading I used to have students do in my social sexualities class that talked about this professor who's a trans man who couldn't even get an ID with his gender on it for the college that he worked at because they tried to make him prove that he had undergone a surgery in order to his genitals in order to get proper documentation. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want the government to know anything about my personal medical history or my genitals. I mean, that's so personal. But the idea is for trans people for many years, in the rare situations where they could get documentation switches, to do so they often had to meet criteria of the state. And those things might not be things that these people actually wanted to do. Meaning there's plenty of people that they're trans, but some people go through surgeries, some people use hormones, and some people don't. And that should be their choice for their body. But the state likes to come in and kind of regulate this for us and say, okay, only certain bodies are acceptable or only certain presentations, and just, kind of not allow people to get proper documentation like a driver's license or a birth certificate that actually reflects who they are. And that can be incredibly painful, kind of bumping up against this wall of bureaucracy when you're just trying to go about stuff that people that are cisgendered have so much privilege in that way that they would never think twice about having to, change their gender on their driver's license or all of the nonsense that goes into that. Okay, so moving on to pronatal policy. This is a policy that encourages childbearing, whether intentional or not. So in Japan and the US, we offer tax credits for every child that's born in a household. And states can also make antenatal policies, right? Like China's one-child policy that was instituted in 1979, which of course in 2015 they changed to a two-child policy. But still, the government is dictating who can have kids and how many kids they can have. So gender is governed with policies influencing all the things that we deal with in our lives, right? How we work, how we marry, how we have kids. Work-related policies can also be pronatal or antinatal, meaning in every other developed country in the entire world, they have paid family leave. This has become a recent controversial thing with the Biden plan, and of course, thanks to Senator Manchin and Manchinima, what was hoped to be 12 weeks paid leave has, at this point, looks like it's not going to be part of the bill. And so, 12 weeks paid leave is what I believe Mexico provides, but not the U.S. The U.S. provides 0 weeks of paid family leave. They have the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, where you can take 12 weeks unpaid leave. The idea being your boss is like super nice enough to let you keep your job for the couple months where you have a baby push out of your body. So what's interesting is when it was on Capitol Hill and there's all the debate, they went from 12 weeks paid to 4 weeks paid, which again, it's better than nothing. Yet 4 weeks is still like a baby is too young to be sent to a daycare. So this really puts the burden on parents. Like, how do they basically either have to choose between quitting their job or working less hours and having a child. And that's just not the case in other countries. Other countries are much more pronatal. They have policies like not just family leave. I mean, my God, in some places in Europe, like in the UK, in France, you could have 6 months to a year paid off with your child. Why? Because it's important that you're actually there when they're developing, right? And this isn't just a maternal situation. This is also paternity rights and just family leave. Because sometimes it's not about having a baby. Sometimes it's, your mother's struggling with cancer, or you have a family illness or emergency and you need to take time to help and address that. There are protections for that in other countries that we just don't have here. Another pronatal policy is that in many workplaces in other countries, and again, in like the more posh, wealthier workplaces in the United States, they offer childcare at your work. It just seems kind of obvious, like you show up to work, you drop your kid at the childcare, you go to work, you pick your kid up, boom, you're out of there. So we don't do that. We have like all of these private and institutions basically, or just organizations that provide daycare for crazy expensive amounts of money. Like at this point in California, if you want licensed daycare for your kid, you're basically paying almost as much per year as you would to send them to a Cal State school, which is insane, because I feel like if I have a kid and I'm putting them through that and spending that much money, then they better like learn piano and Mandarin Chinese and be able to take care of me when I'm old. But that's really not what actually happens. They're just kind of warehoused. So anyway, we can choose to be more pronatal in policy, but what we are in this country, because of the debates around, choice and abortion, we are a pro-birth society, right? We want people to give birth, but then we're not going to give those children food stamps. We're going to make sure that those kids don't have free lunches at school, because that's government waste and that's too expensive. That's socialism, right? When this is just normalized in other countries. In the documentary Sicko, that kind of is a great illustration of this. Michael Moore goes to, he goes to a couple countries, but he goes to the UK and France, and he talks to people there about their experiences of the healthcare system and other kind of social supports that are just offered there. Like in France, you get 6 weeks paid vacation for everybody every year, regardless of, if you're full-time or part-time. So think about how you can support your family, and think about the kind of relationships and with work and just with your life you can have when you actually have time off together. In this country, they keep everyone struggling because then you can't organize and fight back. So it's really interesting part of the film when he asked everybody, like, why is it that, you have free college, subsidized medical care that's single payer universal medical care. So if there's an emergency, there's zero bill. How come they're able to have it and we aren't? And it was really interesting. He was interviewing people that used to live in the US but now live in France. And they said it's because in the US, people are afraid of the government. And in France, the government is afraid of the people. So people get together and they rise up. They try and change any law. They're like, nope, they're in the street for days, right? And that makes a huge difference, putting that pressure, that social pressure, to make sure that the policies actually better reflect what the populace wants. So we have this really interesting situation where people love, and political folks, right, politicians, they love talking about being family friendly and family values and all of these things. But then they won't vote to like let a woman have a couple weeks paid after she pushes a human body out of her body, right? And especially in the case of, so many people getting cesareans, it takes like 6 weeks just to heal from being cut open like that. So it's pretty insane that we expect people to be back to work within sometimes only a few days of giving birth. And oftentimes, even when companies do offer, some sort of support, or maternity leave, then the maternity leave is usually only for people that are full-time. And we live in an economy, as we talked about, that doesn't often give those opportunities to everyone, right? It's much more lucrative to keep everyone part-time because then you don't have to pay them benefits or retirements or any of the things that make life decent. And again, that's why you're in college, so you can get a piece of paper where someone will then pay you more and you don't have to live in that two-tiered market. But anywho, moving on to gender-aware policymaking. So this is a practice of carefully considering the likely effects of policy on everybody. So not just on men, but on women, on people who are non-binary, right? And just different kinds of men and women, because we have to really look at the intersections, right? That intersectionality, that other social identities are going to intersect your gender, and that's going to create very different experiences and opportunities for you. So, things like your sexual orientation, your social class, your race, ethnicity, your disability status, your nationality, your immigration status, among your age, and so many other factors really intersect to create the kind of, social opportunity or at least, your positionality on the world. And so, in other places they've done this, like in the European Union, they've instituted gender-aware policymaking for about 25 years. So, for example, in Vienna, during a recent reorganization of the public transit system, they realized that the transit system was pretty much organized around men commuting to work. So they wanted to make it more friendly to everyone. So they started changing some of the institutional zoning rules to help women with that same system. So basically to minimize the distance among housing, stores, and medical clinics, and schedule more trains and buses during the day when it was assumed they didn't need trains or buses because men were at work. So, trying to kind of go back to the policies that we already have and say, how do we make these more neutral? How do we make these not just about men or women, but how do we make that so that public transit serves everybody? And so that's kind of really the goal of gender-aware policymaking. It isn't, so now the trains are only for women, right? Or anything like shifting the balance too far in one direction or another. The idea is just an equity where anyone can find that equity, can find, or can use a transit system that's built with them in mind, whether they be poor, rich, people of color, white, whatever it might be. The idea of those intersecting identities are important. We need to listen to people that have different concerns than our own so we can then adapt these institutions and systems to better reflect everybody so that we can actually have an equal society. Okay, so how do we theorize some of this stuff? Well, in the chapter, they talk about equal access, equal value, and equal sharing. So they're similar, but a little different, right? So equal access just means ending sexism, focusing on dismantling legal barriers and reducing sex discrimination. So the US is a good example of a society that uses this approach. Equal access is very what we call liberal. And so liberal, I know you hear it like, oh, libs, yeah, all of that kind of crap. What it actually means, liberal, means someone who wants to change the system by using the system, right? So maybe enacting that Title IX, right? Or, changing laws and policies like the Equal Rights Amendment, which has never passed, to try to address sex discrimination or dismantle previously put in place legal barriers, like such as not allowing women the right to vote. So that's the equal access. Equal value model is designed to tackle the problem of androcentrism, meaning the expectation that anything masculine is good and anything feminine is bad. So the equal value model really tries to raise the value of things that are considered feminine so that they match the masculine, so that all of those traits are valued. Versus the equal sharing approach targets subordination by attempting to ensure that men and women participate equally in positions that are, conventionally understood as either masculine or feminine. So, for instance, just those kind of qualifiers we tend to put on things, like we'll say, a male nurse or a female pilot, right? Just saying nurse or pilot and understanding that that could mean any gender representation is something that is kind of part of this equal sharing approach. So gender-aware policymaking in general doesn't necessarily help us know what to do. Again, people disagree about how exactly the approach should work, but the idea is all three of these models are there to try to address some aspect of those three different types of inequality we've talked about, right? Sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. So again, as a result, it's just better to think of feminism as a conversation instead of like a position or a certain stance. Okay, so going back to, from the governance of gender to the gender of governance, the gender of governance just addresses who holds political office and whether that matters. So overwhelmingly, it's men who have been granted the power to govern nations over time. So to give American women the right to vote and run for office was to give them standing alongside men, the right to represent themselves and others in decisions that are being made. So universal suffrage is a massively important step towards dismantling political systems that recognize some people as full citizens but not others. Giving women standing disrupted those three types of inequality, right? The classic patriarchal rule that women can't hold power, sexism. The modified patriarchal belief that power is inherently masculine, which is androcentrism. And men's prerogative to make decisions on behalf of men, or subordination. But who's representing matters, right? So sometimes symbolic representation is really what we're getting. Meaning, does their presence in government actually translate into substantive representation? Or, meaning, are they creating policies that actually change things? Because on many issues such as the economy, religion, or highly partisan issues like abortion, gender makes very little difference in representation. But there is the fact that female politicians do tend to vote differently than men on issues that affect female constituents. And they're much more, incredibly more likely to introduce bills that specifically try to address women's needs, or family needs, or children's needs. So when we look at gender in the American presidency, obviously the U.S. is still yet to elect a woman president. It's that final glass ceiling that has not been broken. So since 1960, more than 50 women have served as head of state around the world. But none of those 50 women were in the U.S. So scholars argue that the U.S. presidency is possibly the most masculine job in the nation. Candidates' masculinity has long been a central feature in presidential campaigns. And of course, in the 2016 election, we really experienced this, right? We saw Donald Trump performing a unapologetic masculinity, but at its core was really about dominating other people. I mean, he bragged about sexually assaulting women, right? He started his campaign claiming that Mexican immigrants were rapists. I mean, it was incredibly toxic masculinity represented on the most powerful and important political stage in the entire world, right? So that really does affect a lot of this. So we know that sexism, hostile sexism, and precarious masculinity were all at work in the 2016 election. And it's interesting now that we've had time to look back at this and kind of do some of the research, we have much more of an understanding than we did while it was happening, obviously. So, based on research that's been done on the 2016 election, Trump voters scored much higher on measures of hostile sexism and were much more likely to report dislike or distrusting of women who work at all, not just female politicians, but women who work outside of the home at all. Among women, their internalized sexism was a predictor for support for Trump. So meaning if a woman was very sexist against women, she tended to vote for Trump. So racism was even more predictive than sexism in voting decisions in 2016. So again, we can see that intersectionality coming in there, right? You had, I think it was like, what was it, 51% or more than 50% of women, white women, voted for Trump. And this is after he bragged about sexually assaulting women, after the Stormy Daniels thing, after all of these kind of, and again, this is the Republican Party had for 30 plus years before this claimed to be the party of family values, meaning, heterosexual marriage, being religious, not a guy who has 3 marriages and cheats on his wife while she's pregnant with a porn star for money. Anyway, that's pretty different, right? That's definitely not the bill of family values, but it was the bluster. It was this hyper masculinized portrayal of extreme toxic masculinity that a lot of people were like, yep, sign me up for that. And that had a lot of an impact on the voting. So it's interesting when we look at the gender gap, which is basically the gap between how men and women vote kind of generally, and these things of course vary dramatically when you intersect them with other factors like social class and race and blah blah. Anyway, there does appear to be a gender gap though, like overall, even when you control for different issues, that women tend to support more kind of social policies that help families versus men tend to be more in support of military or less gun control stuff, things that are kind of supposedly equated with masculinity. So you even see this in the gender gap in presidential voting, as, except for the white women example, every other category of female overwhelmingly voted for Hillary in the 2016 election. And, men very strongly represent or were voted for Trump. So, but again, when you stratify that by race, when you stratify that by social class, and all of these kind of different things and look at the intersections there, you see a much more complex picture come up than just the gender gap itself, but it can be kind of predictive in telling us some things about how the narratives of those particular candidates affected people's political support. Okay, so how do you actually get stuff done? It's social movements. Right? So social movements are collective non-governmental efforts to change society. So feminists have had to fight for rights individually. They've done so through regular politics like voting, supporting legislation, or lobbying, but they've also done so through social movements like protest campaigns, public marches, demonstrations. So much change has been enacted through social movements. Historically, women have used social movement tactics to secure rights for women, and today they continue to do so. So when you look at feminist politics across the generations, there are these different waves of feminism, which again, we always talk about first, second, and third, but we often don't really explore what happened post-third. Like I consider we're at least in a fourth wave at this point. But that to the side, the first wave of feminist campaigns began in the mid-1800s, and they won many, basically the main focus that they had was women's suffrage. But also, they won some other rights when it came to family rights or the right to a higher education. In the 1960s and 70s, the second wave of feminism aimed to end gender segregation in higher education, to challenge job and wage segregation and discrimination, and make marriage and family laws gender neutral. So this could give women, in some respects, more impact within those families, but also another huge touch point was giving women control over their own bodies when it came to sex and reproduction. So if you think about it, how integral that is, to be able to choose whether or not you have a child, that obviously correlates very strongly with your ability to finish college, your ability to get a good job. So they're linked, right? So you need to have control over your body so that you can actually have control over your career, so you can actually finish college in a reasonable time frame. So, these hard-fought rights were integral to women getting to a kind of more equitable playing field with men. So, the first wave, again, of the feminist movement really proposed equal rights amendment, But that still never passed. Members of the second wave then experienced a backlash, which stalled the process of state ratification for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. So many of the changes in patriarchal relations that are discussed in the textbook are really thanks to the mobilization of the second wave of feminism. Okay, so the third wave really starts thanks to Anita Hill's testimony. Oof, right? It's like an incredible parallel to today. When I saw what happened to Christine Blasey Ford, I mean, it's almost the exact same thing that happened to Anita Hill, right? Basically, Anita Hill was sexually harassed by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and this was before he was a Supreme Court Justice. He was being nominated, and so almost the exact same thing that happened to Christine Blasey Ford. She tried to come forward and make it known that he had this history of sexual harassment, and her name was leaked to the media, and she was put on public trial herself. At first, they wouldn't even listen to her, and then all the women that were in the House and Senate basically came together and said, you need to give her an opportunity to speak. So they did, but then they put her on trial. They were like, are you sure? Are you sure he sexually harassed you? Or my favorite quote of the whole testimony was, are you a scorned woman? This idea that, he turned her down, and then she was like, I'll just ruin his entire career. Yeah, that's insane, right? Here's the best part. Clarence Thomas was working for the EEOC when he sexually harassed her. The EEOC is the organization that oversees her sexual harassment. So if anyone should have known better, it was definitely him. So anyway, he did things that were horrible and egregious, and she had to explain every detail of all of it, like how he called himself Long Dong Silver. You can't make this shit up, right? It's too upsetting. And so, basically instead of it being a moment when, these white male senators go, oh wow, this guy's problematic, let's not nominate him to the Supreme Court, they just steamrolled right over Anita Hill. Her life and credibility was just destroyed, and they confirmed him, and now he's on the Supreme Court for life. Soon to be joined by his BFF, Brett Kavanaugh, under almost the exact same conditions, except for Brett Kavanaugh was, alleged by Christine Blasey Ford, said that he actually sexually assaulted her, versus Anita Hill was talking about sexual harassment, but similar. It's interesting with sexual harassment, a lot of people got confused about this with the Anita Hill testimony. They thought, well, he couldn't be sexually harassing her because he's sexually active with other people. Yeah, sexual harassment isn't just about sex, it's about harassment. It's about domination, it's about control. He did horrible things to her that like putting pubes on her drink, just these horrible, I hate even saying them in this recording, I hate even going there. He did stuff that was so disgustingly egregious that any of us would be like, that's obviously sexual harassment. And all of these white dudes sat there and nodded their heads and then still just confirmed him to be on the Supreme Court. So the message that sent to women was that you don't matter, right? Your perspectives, your experiences don't matter. And again, this was an incredible cut and dry case of sexual harassment. And of course, after this, subsequently, other women came out, but it was too late. He's already on the bench for life. So anyway, Anita Hill was a very important figure for third wave feminism. Her testimony and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas led to a wave of women, 24 of which being elected to the House of Representatives. And the number of women in the Senate tripled to 6. I mean, we're talking about from 2 to 6. It's not a huge amount, but that was a big impact in the 1990s. So third wave, was really, it was after that testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee that really woke people up out of this kind of complacency that happened after second wave. So third wave really took a more broad approach to what's needed to end patriarchy, attacking gender norms and the gender binary, and heteronormativity itself, reaffirming its concern with peace, environmental protection, children's health, and public education. So kind of moving beyond just middle-class white women's issues, which was much more kind of the second wave's focus, moving into, issues for women of color, issues for disabled women, poor women, issues for mothers and children, and again, even attacking the whole notion of gender and the gender binary itself to give more space for people that are trans, that are non-binary, to still have rights and, in this democratic society. And again, challenging heteronormativity, or those assumptions that every person's heterosexual and that anyone who isn't is somehow deviant, right? So moving beyond just women, really, in that regard, because a lot of the queer theory and masculinities theory comes out of this third wave as well. So this also is kind of part of the intersectional feminist activism that is happening today. I think it's a fourth wave. Let's just call it fourth. So intersectional feminist activism is just activism that attends to the lived experiences of different kinds of women and men, just different kinds of people. So the third wave, well, again, technically the fourth, but let's say 3.5, really embraces intersectional feminism. Young feminists of color are among the leading innovators of those like hashtag movements, right? Those decentralized, less hierarchical, and more intersectionally inclusive movements such as Black Lives Matter, or Say Her Name, or, Time's Up, or the Me Too movement, or any of these movements that are incredibly important in shaping the changes that we're going to see in the next kind of phase of feminism. So when we look at feminist politics today, younger Americans show the strongest support for gender equality, thankfully. And feminists are just much more diverse than in previous generations, right? That this kind of banner, because again, why wasn't it so diverse before? Because it was exclusionary. It was really exclusionary, especially at the beginning, right? You had women in the first wave that were advocating for, some of them were just like, oh, let's just worry about white women voting and the rest of everyone else can worry about it later. Like, that's obviously not an intersectional movement. So now, and even in the second wave, it was really focused on kind of middle class or wealthier women or white women who, they really missed the concerns of women of color. They missed the concerns of trans women or lesbian women or disabled women or other women that just weren't included in that kind of more dominant group. So today's feminists are just much more diverse. They come from different backgrounds, and it's much more about finding coalitions where you listen to people that have experiences that you don't, to try and learn from them what needs to take place and what needs to happen, to recognize that we have so much more in common than we have differently, no matter who we are. And so we can form movements across those boundaries that make us stronger. When we understand other people's perspectives, that makes us better. So it's interesting, though, that feminists are facing the same old forces that they were up against 200 years ago. It's the same, literally we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. Same deal from 200 years ago. So yeah, that's frustrating. I mean, obviously advances have been made, but it's still frustrating that some of these issues are still ongoing. Like, women gained the right to an abortion in 1973, and that has been chipped away dramatically since 2010 to now. And women are still having to fight for this, right? Even after they gained the right in the 70s. So it's interesting, though, how new communication technology has been used to help collectivize people, right? So online organizing, like hashtags, again, like Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, this has been an incredible tool. It supports a sense of community built around these kind of norms of gender equality. But at the same time, anti-feminists also use technology to strategize around anger about women, like, a woman's a ghostbuster, or like Gamergate or any of this kind of stuff that they basically try and make it uncomfortable for these female advocates online and, potentially try to radicalize violent misogynists. These people that then go and shoot up a sorority, right? And this online harassment makes for an incredibly hostile environment where women are twice as likely as men to report being sexually harassed online. So the internet gives much wider proportion of the population the ability to produce media content, which can help members of groups who have been historically excluded from, representation in the larger media. So the ability to rally around causes or show support and share stories has increased, and this can be really valuable. But also the movement of like people doxing you or swatting, right? Where they find out your address and they send SWAT teams to your house. Like these horrible misogynistic attacks on women that have happened, or I'm sure you've heard of some of these more high profile cases that, bomb threats and death threats around women that are just advocating for equality, right? Okay, so when we look at political ideologies, there's these different political ideologies that really affect the way that people interpret, especially, feminist or anti-feminist movements. So there's been a huge rise in individualism in the US, a focus on the individual over the group, like that the individual is the most important thing that matters. Now, individualism can lead people to assume that gender inequality is just an individual problem that requires individual solutions, but it's not. It's a social problem. It's a larger structural issue. So you can't just say, well, you just do you and it'll end, right? And so it can be very upsetting in a lot of ways, and especially as the corporate environment co-ops feminism. So companies will use feminist-sounding language or feminist-sounding imagery for marketing purposes. And the marketing actually reduces feminism to some sort of individual empowerment, like you buy this product and you'll be empowered, right? Oh, it's so frustrating. So the rise in individualism in the US has led to a decline in civic awareness, which is a focus on the well-being of groups and societies as a whole. Corporate co-optation of feminism has led to companies adopting campaigns that seem feminist on the surface, but they don't actually employ feminist practices. Marketing with feminist content is designed to entice people to buy things, and these same companies often exploit female workers. It's kind of similar to what we call, basically it's pink washing, right? Often you hear this with the environmental movement, like greenwashing, when companies like Exxon try and be like, we care about the environment. And you're like, you literally are destroying the polar ice caps. But it's this kind of way that the corporations can kind of wash themselves as, oh, look at us, we're supporting of these movements, so that they can kind of try and capitalize off of that. So nationalism is a belief in the superiority of one own country and its rightful dominance over other countries. So this is a support for exclusionary policies that restrict citizenship by race, ethnicity, or religion. Kind of like that guy that was like, oh, we don't want people coming from shithole countries. Remember that guy who used to be president? So nationalists see women as responsible for reproducing the nation that nationalists want. And this is a white nation, right? So nationalist thinking justifies aiming pronatal policies like restrictions on abortion at women that are seen as legitimate citizens, and anti-natal policies like forced sterilization towards other women like minority communities and poor women. So Donald Trump's election revealed that Americans aren't as opposed to his view of masculinity as politicians had previously thought. In addition, there's been an increase in nationalism within the United States. Right? They call themselves the alt-right or any of these things instead of Nazis. You hear this a lot. People are like, well, I'm a nationalist. And it's, oof. It's triggering in some ways because it's like a huge dog whistle. Because again, who else, or what else was nationalist, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party. They were very nationalist too. So nationalists, it's like a very slippery slope from nationalism right into authoritarianism, which is the leadership style that celebrates patriarchal power and masculine aggression as national values. So the election of Donald Trump suggests that there's a lot of support among Americans for an authoritarian style leadership, meaning he didn't follow the rules of governance. He kind of flagrantly in the light of day. I mean, don't get me wrong, all sorts of presidents. I mean, we could spend an entire hour on that. How many presidents, obfuscate in some way the rule of law or do things that aren't necessarily ethical, right? But this guy did it in the light of day and was proud of it in a way that just didn't exist in American politics before Trump. You had this interesting, very over-the-top authoritarian style leadership of, I can do whatever I want. And this is even egregious compared to the George W. Bush administration. I mean, they have stretched the idea of executive privilege to a whole new level. Meaning, this idea that like the president has certain powers, right? But this has gotten to the point where like they're like, nope, that means they don't have to answer a congressional subpoena. And you're like, no, that's literally how our system is built, is to be a system of checks and balances. It's supposed to be that, you know, the judiciary, the Congress, and of course the presidency have equal power, equal footing in the culture, and that they hold each other in balance and check. But if you just say executive privilege, whenever you do, whatever you do, and then just completely break the laws of the judiciary and break the laws of the Senate, then yeah, like you should be held accountable for that. So we're kind of seeing that play out with Steve Bannon, who worked for the Trump administration and tried to claim executive privilege into why he wouldn't testify before Congress, even though he's supposed to be testifying about something that happened in 2020 when he stopped being an employee there in 2017. So I don't see how the hell that would be executive whatever. But it's kind of this blanket statement used by the Trump administration. So some people say it's because they just didn't understand how the rules worked in some ways, which is kind of true. But also it was really just a big FU to a lot of the rules as they were. To just say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And it's telling. It's a very authoritarian style thing. So there's been a global retreat from states transparently sharing governance with legislators and citizens. The United States' own score has been consistently falling since 2006, and we're now what The Economist calls a flawed democracy. So that sucks. And then when you look at new political opportunities, this can really kind of show us that there can be, you know, we can change this, we can address this. So the 2017 Women's March on Washington signaled and gained a momentum on new opportunities for feminists to mobilize. The march had a very broad platform that was inclusive towards individuals of all backgrounds. And really, I think, more importantly, noting that it was led by queer, by non-binary, by Black, by Muslim, by Asian, by all of these different categories, by disabled, by all of these women that from very different backgrounds that came together and listened to each other and made sure that they put at the forefront of those demands policies that would end, you know, issues that everyone is facing. So, you know, very broad platform, which was very interesting. And again, crowd estimates range from 3 to 5 million across the United States, making it the largest protest in American history. So societies can be changed. We just need passion, commitment, and cooperation to actually make that happen. Again, that platform from the Women's March is a great example of this, right? They emphasize traditional feminist concerns like reproductive rights and violence against women, but also the problems of violence and policing, workers' rights, right? Disability issues, immigrant issues, and indigenous rights, equality for sexual and religious minorities, and civil rights and environmental justice for everybody. So kind of moving beyond just gender and really leaning into the intersectional nature of providing a better and more equitable society for everybody.